A really big thank you for all of you who braving this very early hour after last night's party. I hope folks had a good time at Universal Studios, those of you who went. But I really do appreciate you coming this early for my session on the last day. So my name's Kyle Marsh. I work in the identity division. And specifically, I work with developers on how to best build for and optimize for the Microsoft Identity Platform. So the Microsoft Identity Platform covers both what we used to refer to as the Azure Active Directory developer platform, as well as all of our Microsoft consumer accounts, as well as our ability to talk to our B2C tenants. So our platform covers a broad range of identities. And I want to talk this morning really about some best practices that we've come across as I've worked and our team has worked with developers around the world building on top of our platform. So I won't go through the list here. But there are a few best practices we want to cover today, again, as things that we've come across in our travels, if you will. So the first thing is I want to talk about what I'm going to refer to as golden rules for tokens. So in the end, you know, we're seen as a very complicated system with identity. But if I put aside the protocol that's used to actually gain the tokens, that is fairly complicated. It takes a lot of time and effort to implement. And that's why we strongly suggest you, as most developers, should be using a library, a well-maintained library, to do OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, rather than trying to implement that protocol yourselves. So we have our MSOL, Microsoft Authentication Libraries, available today. We also, the ASP.NET middleware understands how to do all of that work as well. There's lots of other well-maintained libraries out there, so I'd strongly encourage you to use a library rather than go to the protocol. We're absolutely standards-based. If you have a unique environment or a different kind of development system, sure, go ahead and do the protocol. But I just want to warn you in terms of the cost that you're picking up. These standards are always in flux. They're always getting modified if a vulnerability is discovered. So you can't say, well, I did that. I did my OpenID Connect protocol and it's done. I'll never have to look at it again. That's just not the way this standard works. But in the end, all we're doing is to vastly oversimplify what we do as a cloud identity provider, all we do is give tokens to apps. There's this huge infrastructure about trying to figure out when is the right time to give a token to an app and which tokens should that app get, right? We have privileged identity management, we have all kinds of features, conditional access, and so on, all trying to make sure that we only give the right token to the right app at the right time. But you as developers have a relatively straightforward process. I ask for a token, I either get the token or I don't, right? So managing these tokens and dealing with the tokens is really the heart and soul of what you need to be worried about. So if I look at the golden rules, the first one is you should only use tokens for their intended function, right? We see lots of people trying to use tokens for things that they weren't intended to do. There are two main types of tokens. First off, ID tokens. The only thing an ID token is there for is to identify the user to the application. So there's a person in front of an application, they go ahead and sign in so that the application knows the user's allowed to use the application. They may want to know the actual identity of the user. For that, they ask our system for an ID token, and the only purpose of that token is to identify the user to the app. The second type of token we have are access tokens. And they only have one purpose as well, and that access token is only there to allow your application a specific range of operation against an API. It doesn't really tell you whether the app is going to work or not against that range of operation. It's just that somebody out there trusts you as a developer to use that functionality in the API. And the only reason you're going to use an access token is simply to pass it to that API you asked that you're trying to get your access to. The second rule, never mess with someone else's tokens. Right, we see this happening a lot. First off, one of the key areas we get a lot of questions about and concerns and, hey, this thing's breaking, is applications that want to look inside the access tokens they're getting for the API. An application gets an access token. It only has one use up above to give it to the API. That's not your token. If you're an application developer calling an API, that access token is a contract between the identity provider and the API. You should not be messing with it. And my big concern is you're going to look inside the access token, You're going to say, oh, look, there's some interesting information. That claim looks good. I'm going to make a decision based on that claim. And then someday, because you have no control of what's in that access token, that claim changes or goes away, and now your app breaks. So you should absolutely not look inside of an access token, because you're really just setting yourself up to break it sometime in the future. The other thing is we often see the API saying, well, I don't really care, I just want to use the ID token. So basically you're saying, I don't really want any security around my API, right? Because at that point, if I take an ID token, and the reason this is messing with someone else's token is there's a very specific claim in every token, an audience claim, that says, who is the entity who's supposed to be looking at this token. If the audience claim is for an application, that's what the ID token is going to be. The API is going to get a token that says a different audience, and they're going to say, well, I'll take it anyway. That's not the right way. That doesn't give anyone the kinds of control and security boundary they're really trying to set up. So if I, as an enterprise, say, you know what, I need to make sure that only certain users in this enterprise use this application, if you just take any ID token, you've usurped that process of them being able to lock down that enterprise or to have a more secure posture. So you want to make sure that you never use an ID token, that your applications get access tokens to call an API. The next point is that you should not, as an API, say it doesn't matter, I'll just take any access token that shows up. I can validate the access token came from Microsoft Identity, so surely one access token is as good as another. Again, what you're saying is, I don't really care about security for my API, and I don't want my IT admins having the ability to say who gets to use this functionality or not. Right, we'll look a little later at the idea of using things like roles in tokens. Supposing the API developer says, I need to know which role a user's in, well, I'm not going to get that from the other access token. Right, so you shouldn't be accepting access tokens from other APIs. The next thing, of course, is caching tokens. Sometimes we come to some implementation and someone says, well, this is all working, but they don't necessarily completely understand what exactly is working and what they're accomplishing. One of the things we see is applications that will simply continuously ask for a new token. Now, we've got a lot of scale and we can handle that, but even last week I was talking to a developer who's suddenly facing the fact that we're starting to throttle them because they're asking for tokens every millisecond or so. Right? Hey, I need a token, I need a token, a token. The token we give you is good for a particular amount of time. We tell you how long that token is good for. You shouldn't be asking for another one until that time of that token has expired. Right? It helps our system. It also helps your application because you're not doing a bunch of round trips to the identity provider, getting something you actually already have and is perfectly functional. And then the final, I will point out that all of our libraries, our MSOL libraries, et cetera, know how to do all of this caching correctly. In fact, it's one of the big value points that we have is to make it very easy so that you don't have to worry about caching algorithms and where I should store them and all that, because we'll look after that for you in the MSOL libraries. And the final token rule I'd like to point out is when you get a token, especially in the process, it's an error, if you will, to go look for specific errors. We group the errors into classes, and the reason we do that, for example, the most common one is, hey, there's an error that says the user hasn't signed in, or there's an error that says the user needs to grant consent. But all of these types of errors end up in one class. The identity provider needs to talk to the user. Interaction is required. Right, so during the process, we can acquire tokens silently without talking to the user. We can say, well, I need to talk to the user. They hasn't signed in yet. I'll need to talk to the user. So if you look for a particular code, you may miss the fact that its cousin also needs interaction. So when you check for errors, you need to check for the whole class. Now, one of the things that becomes a little bit tricky for a lot of developers is, no, I need to look inside that access token. Because it's the only way I can actually debug my system. If I'm calling an API and I'm getting an error back, I need to look at the access token because that's my only way of figuring out what's happening. And yet I'm saying, someday you may not be able to look inside an access token. We might encrypt it. We might do something else. You can't rely on what's in that access token, at least for those kinds of things. So how could we look at that in a second? So let's switch over here. So I've got a little WPF app. This is actually just a modification of our WPF sample, quick start sample that you can download. I'll also make this available. So this is just going to sign in. And the reason I actually picked WPF this morning was I wanted to point out that as a cloud identity provider, we don't really care where your application is running, what technology was used to build it. Any application can reach to our cloud to get that authentication. So some people say, well, I kind of have to move my app to the cloud in order to take advantage of modern identity and modern protocols, right? No, you don't. Any application running anywhere can be moved over to modern authentication. So all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to sign this user in. And what we'll see, of course, is the first best sign-on experience anybody ever gets, which is user's already signed in. So the application instantly has information about the knowledge of the user because single sign-in just kicked in. Right? So, and what I get at the top is my regular ID token information. This is all of the claims that I would see in that ID token. But I need to debug this application, so I need to find out what's about the access token. Well, let's close the ID token here, and instead take a look at what we get in what's referred to as the token response. The token response is the packet we send back that includes the access token, includes the ID token. It includes a bunch of other metadata that might be interesting to a developer to determine what's going on. So here, for example, from our mcell.net library, I get a username. I also get the identification of this user in their home tenant, meaning if this user is a guest or accessing this tenant in some other way, I actually could know that right here, because what I'll see here is their home tenant information, and at the bottom of this token response, I see the actual identity of this user that's in the access token. So I can determine right here, without looking at the access token or anything else, is this a guest user or not? Is the user coming from is a guest user, for example, that may be authenticating with somebody like Google? I can determine that there. I also can see, when does this token expire? And one really interesting point here that you can't get out of the token itself, and why you really want to look at this response, is there's your correlation ID. If you have an incident to file with us, one of the things we want from you is, what's your correlation ID? Because that gives us a key to look at to try to figure out what happened in your application. So this is actually a key bit of information that's not even in the token that you want to get from this response anyway. And then here you can see it expires and so on. Oh, one key point, of course, is here are the scopes. The main reason most developers say, I have to look inside the access token is I have to see what scopes are in the token. No, you don't. The right way, the long-term way, the way we're certain will work without something breaking is, I look at the token response, and it tells me what scopes are in that token. So this is the way you would want to debug your application or look for debug information, as opposed to getting in the habit of, I'm going to crack open the access token, I'm going to look in that, because there's nothing preventing someday those access tokens to be unable for you to crack and take a look at. So if you develop a habit of, here's how I do it, at some point you'll say, oh, look, I can't do that anymore. Okay, let's turn over to permissions and consent. This is an interesting area because, of course, one of the things is, how can I get past this as soon as possible? But it's actually a very interesting area of what we do. So let me try to go through some practices here. First off, I want to point out that the permission and consent model has nothing to do with the user's ability to do anything. So even if I'm asking for a delegated permission, and the delegated permission definitions all say things like, read mail on behalf of the current user, right? So they have definitions like that, and yet I'm saying it's got nothing to do with the user. And it doesn't. All it says is somebody, either the user or their tenant admin, trusts that the developer who's making this call, who's going to have access to that information, isn't going to do the wrong thing. And that's why, for example, in user.read, we say, you know what? As the Microsoft Graph API designers think every user should be able to grant an application the ability to read the user's current profile. Right? We build that in just about everywhere. And yet, every user in an enterprise can read the full profile of every other user in the enterprise. I only need to go to Outlook and go up and down a reporting chain to see that. But we think, the folks who designed the Microsoft Graph API think user.read.all should be looked at, because are we certain that that application isn't doing something it shouldn't be doing with what is effectively very valuable corporate information? If I'm going to target a phishing attack, it's much better if I target that phishing attack to come from your manager than some random name. And I can figure that out if I have user.read.all. So all that the permission is about is, do we trust the developer with access to this information? Even in the case of it being a delegated permission. Because maybe I grant a permission to say, read all sites. I'm still only going to be able to read the sites that the user can read. Right? What we refer to as effective permissions kick in. It's still bounded by the user in these delegated permissions. But it's just really there so that somebody can be assured or feel good that the developer isn't doing something they're not supposed to be doing with that information. As I said, all that the permissions do is authorize the application to actually call that API. It's really a very specific, what I would like to refer to as a range of operation. So we have, for example, a very specific scope, user.readbasic.all. And that's there to say what I want to give this application access to is not, say, the organizational structure of who reports to who. I just want to get the basic information I would need to display a people picker. I think that's all this developer should have access to. I don't think the developer should have access to my reporting, et cetera. Now, because the API designer says, I want to have this permission experience, they say, I've got an API, I want to have a read permission and a read scope and a write permission, a write scope. And the reason they're doing that, two things. First off, they want to make sure that applications are confined to only the activity the developer intended. If I have an application ID, the developer has only written the ability to read. The application should not have the ability to write because the developer never intended to do that. But because the API designer said, I want to have this as a scope, they're saying, I want somebody to validate whether this application has this right. So either the resource owner in the user, right? Maybe I can say an app can read my profile, or the tenant admin as a resource owner can say, yes, it's okay in my enterprise for this app to have that functionality. So these permissions are all about the application. As a result, it's really important that you as a developer participate here in making sure you only ask for the range of operation you've actually coded. If you haven't written functionality to write, you shouldn't be asking to write. If you haven't written functionality to read groups, you shouldn't be asking to read groups. And that might be a stair step up in permissions because you're saying, well, I'm going to ask for directory read instead of user read because that seems like it's an easier permission. But you're now asking for functionality you didn't actually develop for. So it's important that you as a developer only ask for the privileges or the permissions for code you've actually written. Right? That helps everybody keep a much more secure posture around what they're doing. Now, let's take a look at some changes, or at least some changes that could happen or I should be thinking about as a developer. One of the things is there may be the idea of granular consent, or at least admins will have the ability to possibly change what you think of as you're developing, what requires user consent and what requires admin consent. Today, there's already a functionality that says, I'm a tenant admin, I'm turning off user consent. That means that no application, no matter what permission it's asking for, gets to run without a tenant admin saying, I bless this application. Again, they're deciding if they trust the developer or the organization the developer works for or what have you to say, yes, I trust this developer with the information they're getting on behalf of my users. But it could be also possible that perhaps an admin that says this is okay here, or maybe you're not aware of a particular environment where that permission might be allowed that you think, hey, this is probably admin required. Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't, right? So that you need to be prepared. The very simple transaction, you ask for a token. Give me an access token to call that API. And either you get it and you can call the API, or you don't, and you need to fail gracefully, right? So no matter what happens, your simple transaction is I need a token that allows me to call that API with this range of operation, you may or may not get it. Earlier I said all we do is deliver tokens to apps, and that's true, but we put a lot of effort into figuring that out. One of the big features we have is something called conditional access. So maybe I'll give your application an access token to that API if the user is running from a location they've run 100 times before, on a device that's fully managed and we know is compliant and doesn't have any malware on it. And maybe I won't give you that same access token for the same user because they're running from someplace we've never seen them run this app from before, on an unmanaged device and an operating system we've never seen before. So why you get the token has all kinds of rich and interesting reasons behind it. Your transaction still stays relatively simple. I get the token or I don't. I will point out one new experience we're talking about today, or this week rather, here at Ignite. We have now something we now refer to as the admin consent workflow. So in the past, if your application happened to require an admin consent, either because the API designer said, I want it to have an admin consent, or the tenant admin said, I want everything to require admin consent, your user might have been prompted with something that just said, hey, admin is required. People don't know who their admin is, they don't know what to do. It was just a fairly unfriendly experience. Now we have a workflow that can be kicked off instead, so that instead of getting effectively a wall where the user doesn't know what to do, there'll be a help for them to move forward. Let's take a look at how using consent really drives your user experience as well. So I'm going to come back to the demo app here. I'm going to sign out of the user we already looked at. There we go. OK. And I'm going to sign in now. I've got the same app. It's actually still just running like it was before. I signed one user out who was Kyle at the tenant here. Now I'm going to go ahead and sign in with my consumer account from Outlook.com. Again, our identity system works for either types of user, so there's no change in code here. In fact, I haven't even stopped this app. This app is just signing in with another identity. And here you see the very basic user experience of first prime in. I'm going to ask to read my user profile and sign the user in. And that's happening because what we're doing here as the sign-in scope is what I refer to as just profile. We're only asking for user.read. So again, my ID token tells me about the user. I can see their object ID. I can see which tenant they're coming from. In this case, if I cared, I could look, oh, look, that's a Microsoft consumer account tenant. And I can look at and examine that. Again, I got the same kind of information here in the response as to which permissions this token, the access token here has already got. So I can go ahead and call profile and get the profile information from Microsoft Graph for my consumer account. All right, so all very straightforward. Now, I decided, because I'm not a very sophisticated developer, that the easiest way for me to figure out what permissions is simply keep the permission, if you will, with the call. So here, in order to get that user profile, I call the me API out of Graph. And I say, oh, look, that needs user.read. And then I'll come down a little further, and I'll say, oh, I'll call the people API, and that API requires people.read. So I'll just keep those two together. And here's something that's going to get all the groups for the user, and I'll ask for that, and I'll say that's the API now, or the permission required. So this is built somewhat for what we refer to as incremental consent. As the user gets to particular functionality, that's when the application will prompt to say, hey, you need to consent for the application to be allowed access to this information. Right? So looking at the way this app is coded, I'm not sure it's necessarily the best user experience, because I've signed in and I called the profile. Great. Now I want to get the people around this user. Oh, look, I'm going through the experience again because it needs an additional consent prompt. OK, yeah, that's fine. And now I'll go ahead and call the groups API. Oh, look, I'm being prompted again because I'm asking for yet another incremental consent. So while that made it easy for me as a developer to do that work, it's not exactly the best user experience. So you as a developer get to choose when users get to see what. Incidentally, this is asking for group.read.all, which when I take a quick pass through the Microsoft Graph permissions docs, it says, that's an admin consent item. So it seems odd that my user account in Outlook.com is admin capability in Outlook.com. That seems odd. Well, it doesn't. It just means that there is no admin to look after the groups in this enterprise, because it's not. It's just me. So that's an indicator, if you will, of you really can't rely on necessarily what you think might require admin or might be user, because that could be changed depending upon the nature of where that application is running. So, and as a follow-up, of course, the nice folks in Microsoft Graph say, sure, here are your groups. Of course, I have no groups. It's just me as an individual in my consumer email account. So what could we do to improve that experience? Well, let's sign out of that user. And instead of saying the only scope I want when I sign in is user.read, let's switch that to every scope that this application needs that requires only user consent, or at least what I believe only requires user consent. That'll be user.read and profile. I'm going to leave the admin consent one off, because there's nothing wrong with this app going ahead and getting my profile and looking for the people around me and only displaying the full list of groups in the enterprise if the user hits some particular functionality. So let's drive that experience. So we'll go ahead and sign in here. And this time, instead of signing in as Kyle the consumer, we'll go back to Kyle working at this enterprise. And again, I'll go ahead and see this time, it's the first time I've used this application with this new sign-in permissions. So user.profile or profile.read got added to this consent screen. Because I said when the application starts, I'd like profile and I'd like user.read as the first set of permissions the user gets. And because this is the first time I've run this app in that mode, I go through the consent prompt. And now you see, instead of, I can still call the profile, and if I call people, I don't get that additional consent prompt, because it already happened. So that's a slightly better experience than our first one, right? And all we had to change there was what consents, what scopes do I ask for at initial sign-in for the user, right? So I'm controlling when the user sees what permission prompt, and that's a key area that you can focus on. Don't focus on things like, how do I use a OAuth 2 protocol to get this token? Use a library for that. Focus on when should I ask for what scopes as I drive my user experience so that I create the least friction for my application. Focus on using least privileges so you make sure that you use the application correctly. And finally, I'll do a quick look for you. I'll go ahead and get for groups. Now this is by default an admin consent item, so I am going through the experience again. But now what you'll see is, instead of simply saying admin needed with practically no other help, I can actually launch a workflow here, and I can ask my whoever, actually I don't know who I'm asking, to approve my application. So I can go ahead, give them a message, send it off, and request approval. Now you as an application developer still have to deal with the fact that this user can't grant that consent, right? So I've gone ahead and formulated, I'll go ahead and send it off. But my application is still going to be denied access because the user was able to ask for the workflow. The consent is not granted at this instant. So go back to the idea of you ask for a token, an access token, you either get it or you don't. You need to fail gracefully when you don't get that token. Okay, so let's turn our attention instead to things that you can get inside the token. So one of the things a lot of applications want to do is have different functionality depending upon who the user is, right? So one way you could do this is you could use Microsoft Graph. If you use the full power of Microsoft Graph, you could do all kinds of things like look for the user's group, look for other attributes, look to see if they have a particular file in their OneDrive, who knows. You could drive a very rich user classification because you have access to all the data of Microsoft 365 there. However, you as a developer can also ask to see some of this information in your tokens. And it doesn't matter what kind of token you're designing here. It could be an ID token for your application. It could be an access token for your API. You can ask for this in either case. So let's take a look at how that works. So I will come here and sign Kyle in again. And here we can see in the ID token, I got a groups claim. So what I did here is I asked the system, hey, when Kyle signs in, or when anyone signs in, give me a list of all of the security groups that this user is a member of. And the way I do that is I go to my app registration, I go to the app manifest, and I enter in, group memberships claims, and in this case I'm asking for all the groups that this user is a member of. So I'll get a group claim for every group that this user is a top tier, a first party member, if you will. So no nested group functionality in these claims, only ones where I am a member of the group at a top tier. So that's one way I could do this work. Another thing I can do is I could define what we refer to as an app role. So here are the app roles that this developer has decided. He's going to have, they're both what we call allowed member type user. What that means is the developer would like the identity provider to provide a UI so that admins can assign users or groups to these roles. So I, as a developer, don't have to do any of that UI. The scripts are available. It all happens through their standard management, if you will. And here I've got two different types of group. I've got an approver role, and I've got a submitter role. So let's go ahead and see how that works. If I go over to my admin here, we'll go to my enterprise applications, and we'll go find this app. Take a minute here. The network always is a little slower when more people are watching. So I guess it's good. It's an early morning slide. It could have been a lot worse. All right, so we'll search for this application. There's our best practices. We can see if I go to users and groups that Kyle's already used this app. That's fine. I'm going to add another user. If I wanted to, I could add a group or a user. I'll come in here. Let's go and look for Jordan. Oops. And I'll select this user. Now, because I have a role, I'm going to be able to pick a role. One tip here is that always remember to have a role for your what you would refer to as your default position. So maybe everybody in the company can submit to this app. But still I have the submitter role because if an IT pro says, I'm going to require assignment for users to this app, you have to pick a role. And if all you have is admin, suddenly he can't assign people who can only submit. So you have to make sure that you have both your default and other roles defined here. So let's go ahead and make Jordan an approver. We'll go ahead and assign that role. Let's go back to our application. We'll sign out Kyle. And we'll sign in Jordan, who I think I might be looking for the phone. Just a sec. Oh, go ahead. So again, this is the first time Jordan's using this particular app, so we'll go ahead and just accept. And here we see that Jordan is a much more popular individual. Kyle is a member of one group. Everybody likes Jordan to join their groups. And in addition, he has the role somewhere of approver. I don't see it here. Let me go ahead and sign him out and sign him back in again. Oh, did I complete that transaction? Yeah. Actually, this won't work because the nice folks in MSOL will have cached the token. But I would get the role. Oh, there we are. It did notice. So there's the role that showed up because the IT pro has assigned Jordan the approver role. So I, as a developer, can dictate somewhat what information is in my tokens by doing that work. I will point out some limitations when using groups. First off, if it's a cloud-only group, it'll only have the ID. If it is synced from on-premise, it'll have the name. That means you have to figure out for your application an interface and create a UI for, hey, it's a cloud group and all I have is an ID. So you have to build like a picker so they have access to the names because nobody knows what the IDs are. And you have to provide that UI yourself. There are limitations to how many groups will show up in the token. If it's a SAML application, you get 150. If it's an OpenID Connect application like our platform provides, it's 200. But if you're writing a single-page web application, apparently the number of groups that's too many is 6. I may not be a member of 200 groups, but I think I'm a member of 6. So the fallback is to call Microsoft Graph to get the information. So you might as well have just called Microsoft Graph in the first place, where you have access to the groups. You have to write the fallback using Graph. To me, it's like I might as well just use that to get the information. And of course, as this requires groups.read.all, that may require admin consent. Now, if your application has a sophisticated profile for the user, it takes you some time to set up this user. What do they have rights for? What functionality are they going to have? You need to have this the idea of provisioning. What do I need to do to set up a user? Now, for an enterprise line of business app, quite often you can just get everything you need out of the directory already. So you can go ahead and call Microsoft Graph to get that. And this is what we would refer to as just in time. I'm going to see a user sign in. I'll get any information I need, either from the token or calling the profile point or some other point of Microsoft Graph, and I'll go ahead and do that. Now, if it's a complicated provisioning user that you need to set up, that might be pretty tricky because it may take a while to get a user set up. And the last thing you want to see in your application is, I'm going to have this user who just showed up sign in, and then 5 minutes later I'll say, okay, you're ready to go. All right, so the other thing is that while we talk about Microsoft Graph, for an ISV, if you're an ISV developer, you may not want to spend, may want a more cross-identity provider system, if you will, that allows you to get your ID profile set up for the user. So we can automatically provision for you applications, users into your applications. So we take a quick look at what that looks like. If I come here to my enterprise apps, and I'm going to look at Salesforce here, applications that are in our app gallery can be configured and said, well, this application supports single sign-on, which of course most of them do, or all of them do. And they can also say, I support automatic provisioning. So here you can see that Matthias has set up our Salesforce to be provisioned automatically from any user who comes into this directory. So every time, and I had to sit through him doing this yesterday, so just to let you know. So any user who shows up and is added to the directory will automatically be told, Salesforce will automatically be told, here's the user, here are the attributes, for example, here are the mappings that are set up. So we're going to target creates and updates and deletes, which will disable the account. And then here's the mapping from what's available in Azure Active Directory to the field that the application development needs to happen. And then whenever a user comes or goes or changes in this directory, the Salesforce app will be automatically informed of that change. What's nice there is quite often users get added to the directory a few days before they even show up for work. That means that user will be pre-prepared, if you will, because your application will have been told when they got added to the directory, hey, there's a new user coming. The way this is driven is through a protocol referred to as SCIM. What we need is for applications, whether it's a line of business app that doesn't want to write a sync engine to watch for users that are deleted, or an ISV app who wants to work across multiple identity providers, you stand up what is referred to as a SCIM endpoint, and we can call that endpoint. About protecting an API, this is a very different point of view. For an API, it is all about you getting the information from the access token. So we do happen to use the JOT token, the JSON Web Token, for access tokens in Microsoft Identity. That means that this token is good until it expires, but who's checking that is the API. So the API gets an access token. You have to go ahead and validate that access token is first off correct, that it came from Microsoft Identity, that it's the dates, etc. And you can do that without actually calling to Microsoft Identity. There is the standard JOT standard of how you validate a JOT token, which is to go to its well-known configuration endpoint to get the signing keys you need to verify the token. But you don't actually call back to our identity service and say, hey, how does this token look? Or tell me about the user. You just validate the JOT token. So as an API developer, you have to make sure you validate things like, is it signed correctly? Is it from an issuer I trust? Is it my audience, meaning it's for me? Is it still valid, etc.? I would strongly encourage you again to use a well-maintained JOT library for this. We have one in .NET, for example, because we'll check the base validation, make sure the signing is done, and that's this code you don't have to write yourself. One other thing, if you're an API developer, you shouldn't be trying to pass these access tokens around. If you need to call another API, you need to call the on behalf of flow so that your API can call another API, which means you need to get your own access token. It goes back to the golden rule, don't mess with somebody else's token. Well, if you get an access token for you, that's not an access token for some other API. You need to get the right token for the right situation there. And finally, of course, you should never accept an access token that's not targeted for your API. So you're going to look at the claims that are in the token, and then you're going to act accordingly. If you're the API designer, now if you're saying a delegated permission, yes, you'll get the identity of the user. You'll also get whatever scopes that you've defined that the application has been consented for. They get to read, they get to write, they get to do whatever it is you've decided. And if you've put in things like roles or groups, those will be in that token as well. So if you say, I want to assign users to this role, you'll see that. If it's an application permission, meaning you've set up your API so an app can call without the presence of a user, what you'll end up there is no user identity, but a roles claim that says, here are the roles for which this application has been approved to operate. A quick word about services. You should be trying, wherever possible, to move to client credentials. So the application uses its own credentials instead of a service account where you create a user account and then share the user's username and password with everybody in the development department. It's better that you use something like the client credential so that, for example, your institution can say, yes, I want to move all my users to MFA, and then find out that half their services broke, and they have to go and find all those accounts and special case them. Now, I do understand that some of the older APIs don't support that, but we are working to move those forward, and we are also working to have additional limitations you can see with resource-based permissions that you see in Microsoft Teams, as well as Exchange's access policy. We also strongly recommend using certificates instead of client secrets. The nice thing about a certificate is you don't actually intercept the secret. If I use a client secret, I'm sending the secret over the wire, and in theory, it could be intercepted. What I do with a certificate is I signed an assertion. Therefore, the private key is still safe in whatever vault I have it, and it's not actually out on the wire anyway. So it's not a shared secret anymore. It's a process. So it's a really good reason to go to the certificate-based model. And if you are happen to running on Microsoft Azure, the best choice there is Azure Managed Identity for Azure Resources, because in that case, there aren't any secrets for your app to lose. A couple of quick warnings about protecting your apps itself. First off, make sure that the redirect URIs you specify are yours and can't be intercepted. So using things like an HTTP address is a bad idea. Using a wildcard URI address is a bad idea. You need to make sure that where you told us to send the token is where you control. Because if you give us an address, you say, hey, send all my tokens here, and you don't control that endpoint, you're not going to control where your tokens end up going. Right, so if you're using a public client, a native app on iOS or Android, there are specific directions for that. If you're using something on Windows, we do have this new native client. There used to be this really ugly-looking string for a redirect URI that started with URN, and I never understood the rest of it. That is an interceptable address. You should be moving away from that as soon as you can, because it is possible that that address can be interrupted. Other things to protect your app. We do see that these client credentials, quite often people are using secrets, because, hey, that's what we use in all of our demos, so why wouldn't you? If you use a secret, there are ways that you could have entered a pretty simple secret. Hey, I'll just go with a single character, or 123456 seems like a good password for this app, because I'm just doing the development phase, and I'll fix it when I get done, and maybe you do fix it when you get done. The problem is, if you had it and don't remember to clean it out, that insecure password is still there, and we do see attacks against applications' passwords or credentials based on things like password spray. So don't use weak credentials, if you will, and again, the right thing to do, there is to use a certificate, make sure that users are never actually in possession of the certificate, they stay in the vaults so that you get the right kind of access. So the Microsoft Identity Platform is kind of three components. Our MSOL libraries are our newest version. Our ADEL library still exists, but now is a great time to make sure that any new projects you start use MSOL instead of ADEL. This is where all of our new work will go. This is where our innovation will go. As we go forward, you want to be on the MSOL library. So it's a great time for any new work to go there. Our V2 endpoint is also in general availability today. Again, encourage that. Obviously, MSOL goes to it directly, but if you're doing some protocol level stuff or open source libraries, we'd encourage you to go do that. One final note here, our Microsoft Graph API has reached parity with our Azure Active Directory API, so we are moving everything to Microsoft Graph, and this is another point where you to go. We do have some guidance here. You can look at this if you download the deck to help you if you do want to look at updating from ADEL to MSOL and the kind of things you can do using those new apps. So that was a very brief and way too fast look at some best practices. I'm a couple minutes over. I apologize for that. Here you got up in time to get here on time, and here I am keeping you long. I apologize. A couple of picture moments. I am on the last day, so the vast majority of these have already happened, so I guess this is your viewing list when you get back. It's nice to be in the identity group because we have two foundations we're a part of. One is, these are all these sessions on identity, and these are all the sessions on the Microsoft 365 developer platform for which we are the foundation. So I'm part of two tracks, the identity track and the Microsoft 365 developer track, and we could be part of even more. By the way, for Microsoft 365, there is a new certification and learning set out there. The identity ones are also getting out there. The first module of about 5 or 6 is already posted there. And it's a great place, by the way, to get yourself a developer tenant, full E5 licensed tenant that you can use to play around with and test and learn. So that's a great thing. Finally, I'd like to say thank you. We're ending all of our identity sessions pointing out you should turn on MFA because you can turn it on free now through Authenticator, and it's the right thing to go. And I appreciate it very much, especially coming so early on the last day. Thank you very much, and please fill out the evaluations. Thanks, folks.